Let's welcome the Shadow Treasury Minister now, Annalise Dodds, because we're going to be talking about this. It was in the morning FT, Financial Times, and it says Labour's vow to take borrowing to £400 billion fires the spending battle. And it has indeed, since that was announced. There have been other developments we'll cover this morning as well. So, Annalise Dodds, let me just get this right. The plan now is to borrow £150 billion in the next 5 years, and then another £250 billion over a decade. Is that right?
Well, first of all, it's good to see you, Andrew, back on the programme for the election campaign. We obviously have set out those plans for many, many months now to have a big injection of investment into the economy, £250 billion, as you mentioned, over 10 years as part of a national transformation fund. What we're announcing today is that we need to have an additional boost to that, £150 billion, to try specifically to deal with some of those regional inequalities. Right. And just so that people are clear about this, this isn't about government borrowing in the short term. It's about something that's very, very common right across the world, which is government issuing debt. It's a good time to do it. Makes sense financially to do it now, actually, in terms of the financial markets, so that we can deal with some of those massive regional imbalances. And, of course, as you know, we've got the most regionally unbalanced economy in all of Europe. But if we don't deal with this, we won't have a big enough economic pie in the future.
Right. But it will involve more borrowing, calculated about £55 billion a year more borrowing on top of the existing borrowing that the government, the current government, is planning, which is already heading towards £50 billion a year. So you'll be borrowing about £100 billion a year. A Labour government. Is that correct?
No, we've got to separate out what that borrowing is for. So Labour said...
It doesn't matter what it's for, you have to borrow it.
But it does matter, because it matters in terms of whether it's short-term or long-term. The current government is saying that it will be, for example, paying for additional police officers and NHS workers, etc., in the short term, without raising any taxes at all to pay for that. Now, Labour said we're going to take different choices around that. The very best off people should be paying in a bit more to pay for that. That's what's called, as you know, consumption spending. Right. What we're saying is, for investment, for the long term, it makes sense to issue that long-term debt, which will pay for itself in the long run, because it's going to raise economic activity.
Every politician tells me that what they do will pay for itself. It very rarely happens.
Well, no, the evidence shows that on investment. It does show that.
My issue is about this extra £100 billion a year of borrowing that you're going to be doing, which will amount to about 4% of GDP. What constraint will you have on borrowing?
So we've said that the constraint has got to be whether this makes sense for our country economically in the long term. So we do not want to be doing what the current Conservative plans are, which are, as I say, borrowing. They'll be forced into borrowing to pay for consumption, to pay for staff, etc.
Right.
Because they're not dealing with those long-term issues about fairness in the tax system. We're saying that we would, where necessary, borrow in order to deal with the long-term structural problems with our economy, but through long-term borrowing.
But it still adds to borrowing, and you've still got to go to the bond markets.
Yes.
I mean, you still intend to build socialism on capitalist bond markets.
Well, you can call it socialism, you can call it fairness, you can call it dealing with those regional imbalances.
You intend to build socialism on money borrowed from capitalists.
Well, to be fair, that's what governments right across the world have been doing.
So therefore,
they've been more successful than the current British government.
need the bond markets to accommodate you. Now, what is your reaction to the head of PIMCO's remarks this morning? It's the world's largest bond investor. What's your reaction to what he said?
Well, I haven't seen his exact remarks. I've been out and about knocking on doors. No, so you'll have to tell me, I'm afraid.
All right, because since you're going to depend on these people, you're going to have to take notice of what they say.
Well, I've been talking to a lot of them for many months.
No, this is the biggest in the world.
Right.
They're saying, given the plans to increase UK debt, we're going to give British bonds a wide berth.
Well, I have to say that if that is his response, it doesn't match up with what many other investors I've talked to have been saying. A very, very wide variety of people in asset management, people involved in the banking sector
Who?
and from other financial sectors. Well, I'd be happy to go through the companies if you like. I think
Yeah.
it might be a bit boring for your viewers if I talked about all the different firms
just
that I've
one
met
would
at
do.
a variety of events, and City UK, of course, who represent the sector.
Yeah, but they don't
overall.
buy bonds.
No, but overall, those different figures, those different companies and peak associations are saying to us that they're concerned about the long-term health of the British economy. They've noticed that investment in the UK has been falling. As you know, private investment has been falling. They know that there are those big productivity gaps.
Right.
And there is a shared agenda on investment between
let me ask
Labour
you
and
this.
those investors.
Does this 400 billion of borrowing for investing over 10 years, front-loaded with the 5-year 150, does that include the 250 billion that Rebecca Long-Bailey has been talking about to insulate houses?
Yes.
All
so
of
that's the part of the National Transformation Fund, which is saying that we need to face up to those long-term challenges around the green economy. And actually, if we don't do that now, we're going to have to spend an even larger amount of money in the future to deal with those environmental
250 billion to green our housing stock, 27, that's included in the 400 million?
Yes, not billion. Not just that, actually, we're saying that we also need to see investment in other forms of renewables, etc.
Right. Is that included in the 400 billion?
Yes. Yeah.
So you won't borrow more. What about infrastructure spending, building railways in the north, better communications, broadband? Is that included in the 400 billion?
Well, yes, aside from in those areas where there's a clear shared interest with the private sector, and as you know, we've set out plans for a national investment bank, a series of regional development banks to boost
But is
investment.
the equity in the National Investment Bank, is that included in the 400 billion?
Well, no, it's not, because actually, as you know, well, I'm sure that you saw our plans at the time of the last general election, where we set out how we would create that bank following the model of other successful investment banks like KfW in Germany, which has done so much to boost their infrastructure. It would crowd in private funding, which is exactly what those investment
banks have done. But you would still be putting state funds in to be borrowed. Does it include the 400 billion? Does that include any of the money you need to borrow to nationalise the industries you're intending to nationalise?
Well, no, because actually, as you've seen from many of our plans, and I think we've discussed them before around public ownership, actually we'd look at those areas on a case-by-case basis. In many cases, for example, if you look at rail, it would be a question of looking at the franchises when they come up, ensuring that they were then in public hands.
That's rail, which is sui generis in this circumstance. If you want to nationalise the national grid, which I think you do, it's worth tens of billions. You need to borrow to buy that, won't you?
But to be fair, I think every one of these network industries is sui generis. I don't think we should adopt a blanket approach to any of them. That's not what we're doing. We're looking at them individually.
You need to buy out the existing shareholders of National Grid, won't you?
Yes, but effectively
and to do that, you need to borrow.
Yes, but to be fair, that would then be creating an asset for government, which would then be shared wealth for all of us.
But you still have to borrow to buy it, don't you?
Well, it depends on the model that is used. And actually, if we were able to...
How else would you do it?
Well, we could, for example, issue bonds to those who are holding currently the value of that asset, and then that would become an asset which is owned by all of us. You know, obviously, we're looking into this, as I said, in a case-by-case basis, looking at the best practice from other countries, and we're not alone in arguing for this. You look at what's happened in Paris around water, for example. There are models of public ownership. Well, Paris is quite a big city.
Yeah, but in terms of I know quite a lot. I know quite a lot about the water system in Paris, and it's not on the scale of this. But let me just, because this is really important. Are you saying that one way you would nationalise, say, National Grid, which is owned by private shareholders and institutionals, is that you would do a compulsory swap of their equity for government bonds?
Well, Andrew, we're looking into how we would deliver this in every individual case.
Well,
I've talked to a number of people involved in this at National Grid in the different electricity companies. Again, we have a shared agenda there to get better coordination, to have that transition.
But is that your plan, to force owners of equity in these major industries, Thames Water, National Grid, generators, the other companies that you intend to nationalise, that you will not buy out these shareholders, you will not say, here's the value of your shares, it's now the state's. you will say we will compulsorily give you government bonds in lieu of your shares. Is that right?
The CBI, you probably remember,
No, I don't care about the CBI. I want to know what you're going to do.
They suggested that this would be Labour's approach, and it was shot down by a huge number of other commentators and those with experience in these areas because they said that is simply not how public ownership has worked in other contexts.
Because it's quite important for pension fund managers who are watching this morning, for institutional shareholders who have invested. Are you saying that a Labour government could make a compulsory swap of shares for bonds?
Well, I don't think that talk of compulsion is helpful, and it does not match up with the discussions that I've had with many of those people with whom we have a shared agenda
these are big
around
issues,
investment.
and we've got 5 weeks of the campaign. When you know what you plan, would you come back and talk to us?
Oh, Andrew, come on. I mean, we need to look at these areas
so will
properly
you come back when you've done it?
we have the civil service also working with us. But we're having those discussions with actors in those industries. This is about a modern approach to public ownership.
OK. I was just looking for an answer. I know when I'm not going to get it. It's a kind of